Alright, in this video we're going to look at using cameras in our work and our motion graphics and see what kind of effect and what they can do for us. But first we need to learn about cameras a little bit here and how they work in After Effects. So I'm going to create a new composition, 1920, 1080, 24 frames per second, and let's make it a minute long and see what we can do there. So okay, what I have already set up for myself actually here is I have some layers. So I'm just going to copy and paste them in. And what it is just some graphics, just some type. And what I did first, what you need to understand with cameras first is that the type will work only in 3D. So whatever you want to work with, you should make it 3D. So I just select all my layers and click on 3D, and now they are 3D accessible. So I can work with the Z-axis as well, which obviously will come in handy when working with a camera. So I have these set up. And what I want to do first, if we're working on cameras or working with cameras, is I want to use this option here to see different ways we can see the camera. So right now, and usually always by default, obviously, we have our composition set to the active camera. So the active camera means that we are seeing exactly what's going to be rendered, what's going to be seen, what is actually happening. Great. But what I could also do is see some of these other options here and look at my custom view ones. Say, okay, well that's a camera that is by default the custom view, kind of seeing it on this isometric angle and certain perspective. So the camera's up here, it's not front facing anymore in this perspective, but realistically this is exactly what's going to be rendered. So what I'm going to do instead is I want to see two up. So I'm going to click on this one. It says here one view. I'm going to go to two views. So I have access to see my active camera at all times and access to see the custom view. So I could change that. I maybe want to see the front of it, which is the active camera angle, the left of it, let's see the top of it, let's see the custom view 2 and custom view 3, and so on and so on. So there's a few different options here, which is pretty cool, but I'm going to keep it at custom view 1. So now what I can do here is I could actually rotate around with my camera tools to actually see, get a better idea of what I can see here by clicking on my orbit tool. So if I click on the orbit tool, I could move that around and kind of get a better sense of my, using my X, Y, and Z axis to move around. I can go to the back of it, I could go underneath it. So that kind of just rotates it around in an interesting way. And I could use my X and Y, or they call it here, it's going to be your pan. So you kind of like you're panning around the X and Y axis. So I can move that around how I need to. And then my dolly, which is my kind of bringing it forward, bringing it backward on that Z axis. So this is more or less the X and Y, and this is the Z. So I'm just playing around that. I can also move through these tools using the keystroke C. So if I click on C, now I'm on orbit. If I click it again, I'm on the X and Y. If I click it again, I'm on the Z axis. So just another way for you to see and change up the custom view so you could kind of see the work a little bit better if you're trying to focus on something specifically. This really definitely does help you look that way. So we're going to leave it at that for now, and that's it. So I have my one active camera and my custom view. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add, let's pretend I'm done my design, I'm happy with it, I created some motion or whatever I did, and now I'm going to add a camera. I'm going to add some interest with this camera. So I'm going to click on here, and I'm going to go to layer and new camera. And what's going to happen is this box shows up. Let's take a look at this box here. So number one, I could set up a 1-node or 2-node camera, which we'll go into a little bit. Let's start with a 1-node camera. And the name of the camera, I should definitely name it, or I could name it later here in the layer panel. I can change that, but right now I'm just going to look at the different sizes. So the presets, I could have a 15mm and a 200mm. I can go in between. And I could obviously make a custom one. The 15mm is going to be very wide. It's going to show a lot of information, but it's going to be very close to the subject as well. Where a 200mm, or even later on, it's going to be very narrow, but it's going to be very far away from the subject. So let's look at a simple 50mm, kind of in between to give us an idea. Now, the film size, the zoom, the angle of view, all this, they're all relative together. They all work together. So if I change the film size and scrub, these change as well in how that works, okay? If I change up my focal length, I'm going to change my aperture as well and my angle of view as well. So they are all kind of connected in that way, but we are going to go through these a little bit more specifically because anything that can be changed here can be changed actually over here. Except I think for a few of them, like film size. But once again, once I bring it in, I'm going to show you that. So I'm going to go back to my 50mm, and I'm just going to say, I'm going to call this one 50 1 node So I know, sorry, 50, and I know what that is. So I'm going to press OK. Now, something happened here, right? I brought that in and it's blurry. That's okay. But what also happened here on this one, I'm actually able to see my camera. So I'm just going to zoom in and out. There is my camera right there, this little box. It has the X and Y, so I could move it. And as I move it, here's my camera here. I'm going to twirl this down. I'm going to twirl and transform. And what I see with transform, I see my position, I see orientation, X, Y, and Z rotation. Well, let's take a look when we start moving up my Y, what happens? Okay, so the Y axis is moving, and I can see what's happening here as well. I'm moving it up and down. This is what's happening. Okay, great. And if I kind of now orbit over, so I can see it a little bit better, I'm now able to play around with the other ones here. So my blue is my Z, so I'm moving in and out. Okay. And it's getting blurry and I'm going to fix that blur in just a second. And I have also the red, the X axis. I could tilt it and see how the camera is tilting. It's tilting on this like pivot point as if it was on kind of like a tripod. It's moving up and down and it's tilting that. That's the difference between the 1 node and the 2 node, but I'll get into that a little bit further. So right now it's blurry. Now let me set this up where we can get rid of that. And what I want to look at is the camera options. Okay, so let's look at the zoom, depth of field, focus distance, aperture, and blur level. Okay, right now the zoom, let's see what the zoom does. I'm going to do a top level here. So I'm going to change this view. And notice that when I click on this, these little blue frames show up saying I'm looking at this view. And if I click on this, well, now this one's active. Well, right now I want this one to be active. I'm going to change the view to top. And now when I look at the top, I'm going to zoom out. It's going to give me a better sense because I know that this line here is my actual work. So let's take a look and see what we can do to bring this in focus and play around with some of these things we have here. So the zoom, let's scrub this and see what we can get. So I'm going to scrub and let's see what happens with the zoom. Okay, so I'm zooming this part of the camera. The camera's down here, but this part of what it can actually see, I'm going to zoom in and out. And as I zoom it up, it's going to bring it closer. And if I bring it back, but once again, it's getting a little more narrow as I go higher, but it is bringing it closer. Okay, cool. And let's bring it down. I'm holding down shift to make it go a little bit faster. So it has a very specific area that is going to allow me to see and get it in focus. Okay. My depth of field is on. So the depth of field, what happens is if I shut that off, everything will be always in focus. And that's not necessarily what I want all the time, but if I have it on, what happens is it has to have a certain area that allows it to be in focus. So right now, clearly not in focus. So that depth of field allows me to have something that's closer to the camera out of focus, something further away from the camera out of focus, and a certain area that is in focus. So it allows me to have that. Let's look at the focus distance. What does that do? I'm going to zoom in a little closer. So what it's doing is it is changing up this line here, which is bringing it into focus or out of focus. So I could change that focus distance. But what I could also do too is actually move the camera closer, and that will also affect how it is in focus as well. So I'm just playing around with that. I'm going to use my hold down shift to move it closer or further away, and make sure the resolution's on full if you can, so you can have a better understanding of what is actually blurry and what isn't, because obviously if I was on quarter, everything would look blurry, but if I'm on full, I have a better chance of understanding what would not be. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, and there I am closer to not being blurry. And my aperture, so the aperture will allow me to say, and once again, kind of focus on the blurriness and what's going to be clear, but it could actually, once again, what is actually changing here when I do that? Well, nothing visible here is actually changing. Let me zoom in. And what I'm changing is that kind of like the lens on the actual camera, where I'm moving it so it actually will allow it to be bigger or smaller. So obviously the larger it is, the more out of focus, and the closer it is to 0, the more in focus it will be. So we could bring that right down. And then the blur level. So if I brought this up and it's still blurry, I could also bring down the blur level. So I see, once again, no blur, or almost the depth of field is off. But I could also bring the blur level way past 100% and actually make it very blurry. So I actually have control over how much blur I see as well. I'm going to set that back to 100. Now, because I played with the specs at the beginning, that's why it was out of focus at the beginning. So I'm going to make another one, another camera, but this time it's going to be in focus right away. But before I do that, and then the iris shape we look at too. The iris shape for fast viewing, fast rendering, we keep our fast rectangle on. But we do have other options here which actually take more preview, RAM preview. They will create a little bit more lag, but it will change up the size or the shape of the iris, which will kind of change the way the blur looks and how it will be focused anyways. But we're not really going to play around with that just yet. We're going to keep it at fast rectangle. Now these ones will affect all these other ones below. Iris, rotation, roundness, aspect ratio, different will actually affect these particular ones, and I'm not really going to look at these ones either. But this is kind of how we can get things into focus, how we can play around with the camera. Now the thing is, we have to realize this is just one camera. Everything stays the same. It's just the camera that changes and moves and creates some motion in my active camera default. So let's go back here, and I'm going to add another camera. So that camera did something interesting there, right? Actually, let's get it back to in focus. Okay, right about there, great. And I'm just going to leave that alone. I'm going to add another camera. So I'm going to go to Layer and New and Camera. And this time I'm going to click on a 2-node camera. We're going to see the difference there when we play around with that. And let's make a 24mm. Let's try this one out. So I'm going to set this to be 24. And it's going to be a 2-node. And we'll see what this one does. And I'm going to leave all these alone. I'm not going to touch these. These are the presets. If I start moving these around, I don't want to do that. Enable depth of field. Once again, I could change it. Lock to zoom. I could keep that on as well. And I'm just going to say, okay. All right. So that's the camera. This is obviously a little bit different than what we saw with our other camera. So it's closer to the subject. And this is kind of has this conic shape, where this one has this shape here. And it's closer to the subject, and it has pretty wide. So that's about the 24mm. So once again, the 18mm and higher will be closer to the subject and have a wide angle, where something higher, the 200 or anything like that, will be farther away from the subject and be a little bit more narrow in terms of its field of view. So let's look at what the difference is between the 2-node 24 millimeter and this 50mm. So let's bring down our transform and our camera options. Now the camera options are the same. Nothing changes there with our camera options. So we have the same camera options. But what we do have is a change in our transform. Well, let's take a look at that. So if we look at both transforms, what we have here is our normal position orientation XYZ. Here we have a new one, point of interest position orientation XYZ. Well, the point of interest is a new one because that's the difference between the 2-node and the 1-node. What the point of interest allows me to see and use is now, instead of it rotating like the 1-node on like a tripod looking situation, here with the 2-node, it actually will rotate on the point of interest. Let me show you what I mean. So my point of interest right now, I'm going to move it so you can see exactly what it does. So my point of interest is this line right here. So I can move that around and set it up. It's almost like an anchor point. And as I move it, obviously we're having some motion here as well. So there I can move my point of interest to be further away or closer. I can move, let me change this angle up here to my custom view, and I can see how it will move on its Y as well. So that point of interest moves, and notice how the camera now is tilting based on the point of interest. Okay, so I can set that up, and I can also set up an X and Y. See how it's rotating based on that. Okay, so I set that there. And now when I change the position of my camera, it's going to base it on that point of interest. So I'm going to change my X. See how it's not rotating from this point here. It's rotating based on the point of interest. So I'm just going to move that here. And as you see, as I scrub through, you're actually seeing some pretty interesting ways that we can animate this too. So once again, it's rotating on that point of interest. That's its pivot point. And the X and Y, same thing. It's kind of moving on that as well. It's zooming into the point of interest and zooming away from the point of interest. Okay. Now we can also take a look at the orientation, which will just do a quick Y and see what that does. Now this part, the orientation does have the camera angle move and pivot from here, the camera itself. Okay. And let's do a Z as well. Now it just kind of rotates on that axis. And we could do some of these as well and utilize these to spin at 360 degrees or specific degrees within that. And that is kind of how these cameras work, okay? So let's move along a little bit and play around with our camera options here. So once again, I'm going to go on, click on this one and make sure I'm on the top so I could kind of get a better sense of what's going on here. So you know what, let me reset this one here so it's exactly where it should be. And let's play around with the zoom. So what does the zoom do on this one? Well, it changes that zoom angle so I can bring it in closer or farther away. But keep in mind, I have my depth of field on, so nothing blurry really happening just yet. So if I go really close, bring it in, notice what is happening with the shape of my field of view. I'll bring it back. All right. So that is always staying in focus. Now the depth of field on, the focus distance. So if I brought up that, I'm going to leave the zoom as is, and I'm going to bring up the focus distance. And what that is doing is increasing the distance of the focus, but right now, because everything's on the same plane, everything will stay in focus here. But if I were to move some of these around, which I'm going to do later, we'll see how we could focus on individual pieces as they are changed on the Z-axis. My aperture, so once again, that aperture, if I move it up, it should change the blurriness. My blur level is up to 100. And as I move it really, really farther along, I'm getting a little bit blurrier subtly. And I am using my shift key to make it go much faster, but I am definitely getting a little bit more blur there, but very subtle blur, which is nice too. So this is kind of an interesting way to play with our 2-node camera, 1-node camera, different millimeters, so different lengths of it, and see what we could do. So, but what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to mess around and play around with my 1-node camera here. So I'm going to shut that off, turn this one on, and let's just do some really, really basic. I'm going to reset everything. Let's do some very, very basic animations and see what we could do with this. So with the camera, everything's in play here. I have my camera options all set up in, you know, the way they were set up before. So I'm just going to start moving things around. So let's do quick animations. So I bring my CTI to 1 and let's just do a quick point of, oh, sorry. And for some reason it changed. I actually don't know why this happens, but now it changed to a 2-node because now it has a point of interest. So that's okay. Because what I could do now, I'm going to click on this camera, go to layer and camera settings and change it back to a 1-node camera. I'll say, okay, now it's back to that, which is great. Reset. When I press reset, it adds a point of interest back. So once again, I click on it. I'm going to go to layer, camera settings, and make it 1-node. So I'll be sure not to click on reset to make it a 1-node. So it's just going to be, or sorry, to keep it as a 1-node. So everything's in focus, looking good. Could be a little bit more in focus. So let's get back to our camera options here and make sure our blur is 100. Our aperture maybe needs to change. There it was. There we go. Now I'm in focus, looking good. I'm at full resolution just to make sure I'm correct there. My focus distance, I'm going to bring it right up to that line where it originally was. And that's it. So now I'm looking good. I'm going to zoom out here. And now I'm just going to create some angles and play around with some of this animation. I'm going to do a position change. So I'm going to stay here and I'm going to move it up a few seconds. And I'm going to increase the size. All these have to move up all the way to the end, just so they stay there. Great. And now I'm going to do a little change here. I'll do an X change. All right, just what's happening? You see the camera's just moving off. That's great. I'll bring it back. There we go. Okay, I'm going to bring it over. Now I'm going to do a Y position, a Y change. Okay, just kind of goes up. And if we look at this while that's happening, let me go to my custom view 1 so we can actually see what's happening when that camera does that. We see what the X did, so it just moved to the side and then moved back. And now my Y, I'm bringing up. Now this is changing because I'm actually not stopping the X from happening here. I'm just adding a Y. So that's why, but I just want to show you what the Y did. So it's moving up and down on the Y axis. And then I'll bring it back down. Okay, so it's just moving that. And what it's also doing is creating this path here, which we're going to play around with a little bit later. And then I'm going to do an X. Bring it in. You see the camera moves in. Say to design, and I'm going to now bring it back. Okay, or actually even further back. Cool. So what happened was I did create this path. So let's quickly go through and play this and see what it does. Okay, it goes there, brings it back. Now it's not actually following the path here, which is fine, but we can see what's going on here. So that's my camera moving. Now, if I wanted to actually do that, I could do all of that with a position change, but I wouldn't be, you know, I couldn't add that blur to it. I'd have to manually add blur. So adding a camera can really allow us to do some pretty impressive things very quickly instead of doing all different changes for each one of these. I'd have to, you know, select all these, make a pre-composition, and then do position changes, scale changes, and all this. And I don't really want that, obviously. So I can make far better use of the camera, which is nice. So what I want to show you here is with that, I could actually play with this path. If I click on position again, my path shows up. So let's take a look at this path. The path is more or less a vector path. So I could actually click on parts of it and see my little point here. Now that is a particular spot where I can move these things around. And I can now really kind of fine tune what I want to have happen here at certain parts. So I could play with control arms and really play around with the path a little bit more in an interesting way. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. And once I click on an anchor point, that particular point actually coincides, is relative to a keyframe. So this keyframe is this one right here. So what's happening at that keyframe? Well, this is what's happening at that keyframe. I have I'm going to bring it back over here. So at that specific keyframe, right there that I was on, this is what the coordinates are. This is what everything's showing me. That's what's happening. Sorry, let me click back on that. I just want to move this. And if I click on this keyframe, well, it's relative to this keyframe and what's happening at that point. So I can move these things around and really fine tune what I want to have happen here. So just another way to play around. So even if I zoom back out and I press play now, I obviously played around with this quite a bit, creating a different motion, different path, and different things happening on it, creating a little bit more curve and kind of some smoothness, but obviously playing around a little too much, just having some fun there. So that's a way we could play around with our camera and move it around. And remember, that's just one camera. Really, this is exactly what's happening. Nothing changed in terms of the position of my graphics currently right here. If it's a picture, if it's type, if it's shape layers, if it's a video you brought in, if it's whatever, visually, nothing changes. It's just what the camera perceives and how it is changing it. So let me look at now this version. So I have this 24 2 node. Now I have my point of interest. Let's play around and see what this can do. Same idea. So I'm going to click on my point of interest. Let's see if I can, once again, I can make any of these animatable. I'm going to move that around. I'm going to zoom in here so I can see where my point of interest is. And let's see where that is. It's right. I just want it right in the middle there. Once again, if I reset it, it takes exactly where I want it to be. And my point of interest is there. So now my position is going to rotate around that point of interest. So let's do a position animation. There I go. I'm going to do an X. Oh, that's pretty cool. I have a little bit of blur on there. So now if I wanted to change that, I could fine tune some of these to make sure that it is blur, or I could shut it off, of course. Maybe that's what I want. So I'm also going to now bring that back. So remember how it is rotating on that point of interest. That's like its pivot point. So I'm going to do a little bit of a Y. And bring it back. And I'll do a Z as well. And when you go too far, it just flips around. As you can see in my custom view here, it just flips it right around, and obviously we can kind of control that, but we don't want to go too far. Let's just say that's where we are right now. And then once again, I'll bring it back in that focused area. Once again, I could change that. Let's actually change that. So I know that right here it was blurry. So if I wanted to at this point, I could change focus distance. And once again, I could just shut it off. Let's change up the blur level. So if I want a little less blur, I can. Instead of just shutting off my depth of field, I could just move my blur level how much I want. If I want it to be very blurry, I can bring it really high up, or I could have none, but let's add a little bit of blur. Okay, and I can change up my aperture. So remember, if I bring my aperture all the way down, it won't be blurry at all. If I bring my aperture up, changing the size of it, it would obviously make it blurry there as well. Focus distance, make things blurry there as well. So there's a few different ways to change where things are actually focused. I'm just going to leave it at that, and let's play that through. So this, I took off some of that blur. There'll still be some blur there. I could make it blurrier. And that's it. Just kind of interesting. And once again, if I want to, I could play with that path, but I'm not going to in this situation, but we can do that if we wanted to. Now, I do want to show you another way to play around with this, is using actually a null object, an object that is invisible, to help us move a camera around, because I'm going to show you a different way to do this. So I have my content there. I'm going to shut off my camera, back to normal here. Great. I'm going to make a new camera. Once again, I'm going to keep it at 24. I'm going to say 24, one node. And it's going to be, that's fine. I'm just going to leave everything in lock to zoom. Okay. And there it is, perfect. But now what I want to do is I want to create an animation where I zoom in on a word, zoom out, zoom in on a word, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out. Okay. So I'm going to play around with that. And what's going to happen is I'm going to have to move my camera around. So I'm going to set up a position here. So click on that, and I'm going to zoom my camera in. I'm actually going to move it right here. Now, if I zoom in here, and I can actually access what I want to access. So I want to click on the Y, I can click on the Z, I can click on the X. I can try to fine tune this. I'm using my orbit to try to find and get exactly where I want it to be. I can click on that circle in the middle, the gray circle, and focus on my X and Z, what it's doing. But if I wanted to access all of them at the same time, it's going to be very difficult to find exactly where that is. Now, if I'm moving this around, I am moving the camera, which is obviously moving my position here, which I don't want currently. What I do want to have happen is I want to move this so it will change, and I could zoom in just on graphic. So let's just try to zoom in on the word graphic. I'm going to zoom out here, zoom out here. So what I was trying to get at is I can't really move it here so well. I can, but it might be easier just to move them here instead. So let's do both. So here I have my node set up. That's fine as is. Then I'm going to move it, bring my CTI over, and I'm going to move it up, and I'm going to move it over, and I'm going to move it in. I got to make sure I could find my Z. There it is. I'm going to zoom into the word graphic. So it's a little tricky to fine tune exactly where I want to go. Move this over a little bit this way. Zoom in a little more. Okay, there I go. And even for this purpose, I'm actually going to shut off my depth of field. I want it to always be crystal clear. So there I go. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to reset. Actually, if I do press reset, it's going to add a point of interest, which I don't want. So I'm going to have to bring it back out. So I'm just going to click on this keyframe and copy it here, paste it in if I can, click on position, paste it in, and now it goes back to normal, which is what I want. I kind of want it to zoom in, zoom out. Now I'm going to focus on the word design, but instead of using this over here, I'm actually going to bring it in manually. I'm going to use these coordinates here. Might be a little bit easier to get to. I'm going to zoom into design, just use my Z. Okay, that's what I want. Great. and I'm going to bring it back. And remember, I'm just going to copy this keyframe and bring it at this point, paste it in, because I'm just bringing it back, setting that exact same properties there. I'm going to zoom in, but now I want to get to all day. And notice how the camera is moving there as well. Okay, I'm going to copy this one again, copy, move it over, and I'm going to paste it in, make sure my position is highlighted, paste. And my last one, I'm going to move it to everyday. So once again, I'm going to zoom in, move up my X, move up my Y, and that's another way to do it. And zoom in really close. Let's move it over. There we go. And I'm going to bring it back to normal again, move it over, and paste this keyframe in. So now let's watch this. Now I could have done some easy ease and really play around with this and kind of do something interesting here. So this is one way to do this with this one node camera. Two node would be a little trickier because finding that point of interest would be something else. But what I want to show you now is I want to show you a different way in how we can control that with a null object. So let's do that. I'm going to go to command minus out here. I'm going to go to layer and create a new camera as well. The same thing, it's just going to be 24 mil, one node. And now I'm going to add a, and there it is, there it is. Now I'm going to add a null object. And what I can do with a null object, I'm going to position it. So I'm going to hold down command, double click on my anchor points right in the middle. By default, it's aligned in the middle of my composition. So there's my null object. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to parent link this camera that I just made to the null object. So how do I do that? I'm sure my parent and link are on. Right click if it's not, go to columns and parent and link. And now I can say that I want this camera to control, or this null object to control this camera. So I'm going to link it to null1, or I could use my pick whip and just say, you know, to null1. Now they're connected. So this null1 is now the parent of the 24 mil. And these two are connected. I could actually lock this so it does not move. It just remains as is. But if I ever needed to change the camera options, I can. And now, instead of moving the camera, I'm going to move the null object, which is connected to the camera. Or I should say the camera is connected to the null object. So I'm going to do an animation with my null object. I'm just going to move this around. And look what I have. Anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity. I have all these options like normal. But I'm going to do a position. I'm going to do the exact same animation I just did, but this time with a null object. So my position, I'm going to make it come in, zoom in. But once again, that's a little tricky because I don't have it as 3D. So let's make it a 3D object. And now I can move it around a little bit easier. So I'm going to now change that position. I'm going to zoom in. And I'm going to find where I want it to go. And manually, I can make this work. Oh, I don't want to move those. So let me lock those. Let me reset this. And now I'm going to, and now what I can do, I'm going to take this and I'm going to move this around. And because I have control of the null object now, I can manually move it to where I want it to be. A little bit easier. Zoom in. All right, and once again, I can fine tune it. Oh, I should have set up my, but that's okay. I'm just going to bring this over here and set up my keyframe here, position. And I'm going to reset it at this position. There we go. And now I'm going to do a reset again here, bring it back. And now this time I'm going to zoom in. So utilizing the null object to control this as well is pretty useful. I'm going to reset, goes back, and can really help us kind of move things along a little bit quicker using this null object controlling the camera. So I'm just positioning it in the middle of where I want it to focus and then just zooming in on my Z axis, bringing it closer. And then I can fine tune it with my Z and Y if I need to. Oh, a little too far. My mouse is giving me some issues. All right, so we did the exact same animation, but this time it was a little bit easier because number one, I was able to use reset without it adding a point of interest, and I was able to move that null object around a little bit easier in certain spots that I wanted to as well. All right, so having a null object control the camera as well is another way to utilize the camera and see what kind of effects we can do there. Now, the next one I want to play around with is utilizing these shapes again, these the type I have. I'm just going to duplicate those, bring them up, and I have them all together. But this time, what I'm going to do, I'm going to change how they are located on the Z axis. So I'm going to move this around. I'm going to click here, click on my view, and I'm going to show you where these are going to be positioned. So I'm going to change these up. Now, the thing we need to notice about these, I'm going to transform these, I'm going to zoom this out, is that I'm going to make these appear different on the Z axis, and then what I'll do, I'm going to bring my camera in, it's going to kind of zoom past them, it's going to be create an interesting effect. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to change up each of these words or graphics on the Z axis a little bit differently. So I'm going to start with the word everyday, and I'm going to bring it closer to the camera or closer to the viewer. So let's make this on the Z axis minus 1000, no, up here. There we go, minus 1000. And what that's going to do is going to bring it closer to the viewer, so even closer here. So this is where it appears. So this is why this viewport really helps me see a little bit better how that works. Then I'm going to take all day and do minus 500, so it's a little bit further, but not much further. And then I'm going to take the word design, or sorry, design is going to stay exactly where it is, and graphic, I'm going to move it to plus 500, meaning I'm going to make it further away. It's going to move down the Z axis even further away. Now, if we look at this, this all looks a little messed up here on my active camera, what I kind of want it to look best. Here, it makes sense of what's happening. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to reposition these manually and make it look like it did before. So I'm just going to take graphic, bring it here. I'm going to take all day, bring it here. And I'm going to take every day, bring it here. Now, obviously, they look a little off. That's okay. I'm going to scale them down. Hold down Shift to make them work. And you'll notice that, yes, they're scaling and they're looking like they're going to start fitting in, but they're still on their opposite Z axes. They're obviously further away from the camera, from the viewer, like they were before. I'm just changing the scale to make it seem like they are actually all on the same plane. I'm changing everything but the Z axis. And there I go. Kind of close there. Great. But we know that obviously they are definitely not on the same plane. One here, one here, one here, one here. And look at where the camera is right now. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have the camera kind of fly in and see how this changes. So let's do a little bit of an animation here with the camera. I'm going to shut the other cameras that were on. I'm going to shut them off. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to add that camera in, a new camera, and it's still going to be the 24mm because that's how I originally had it set up, even though I shut those ones off. And I'm just going to say okay, so now that's on top and everything seems fine here. Now keep in mind, this actually is a little bit out of focus because it's really close to the camera, where these ones are a little bit more in focus, a little bit further away from the camera. So maybe I need to fine tune that first to make sure everything's in focus. So I'm going to click on my camera options, my blur level. Once again, if I brought it all the way down, I'm going to keep it at 100, which is fine. Or if I shut off my depth of field, everything would be in focus again. So what I need to do is I need to change it so everything's in focus at the beginning, and then everything as they fly past will get a little bit more blurry. So let me change up my aperture, bring it down a little bit. I should bring it down all the way, and let's see what happens when I now zoom in with my camera and change the position and with the Z-axis. So I'm going to start here and have that, and then I'm going to move it in closer and go past all that type. So let me Command minus, and I'm just going to bring my camera in, and I'm just scrubbing the camera on the Z-axis, and it's going to appear right there. We're going to stop because at this point it's going to start, potentially will turn around. No, it doesn't turn around, which is good. Okay, there I go. It just goes further and further in. Where's that last point? Right there. Perfect. Okay, so now let's play around with this. So it's definitely moving through the space, which is really, really nice, but it's not really blurring anything out. So let's play around with that a little bit more so we can get a better sense of kind of space and dimension. So I'm going to bring this up here, and I'm going to play around with this right about at this point, and let's just add some more aperture. And that blur level, I'll leave that. So we see a little bit more blur when it gets closer to the camera. So even more so, we could bring up that blur level just to have some fun with it. And that's it, kind of playing around there. So this is one way to animate it, kind of have some fun with how we want this to be played out, different ways to play around with the cameras. Now the last thing I want to show you is a way to actually have all our cameras off. You know, I'm just going to get rid of these. I'm going to turn these ones back on. And what I can do now is actually always have something in focus no matter what. I'm going to have one object always in focus. So I'm going to create a new camera. Now the only way this works is with the 2-node camera. So I'm going to create a new camera, 2-node, and I'm going to set up a, I'll just call this focus, in focus, and it doesn't really matter. Let's say in focus for now, and I'll keep it at 24, and I'll say, actually no, I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to bring it back to, let's say 50, and I'll say okay. So what I can do now with this, I'm going to bring it down here, and let's just say I always want graphic, or sorry, the word design to always be in focus. So what I can do, I'm going to select the camera, and I'm going to select the word design, or the layer that I always want to be in focus. I'm going to right click, and if I go to camera, and I can say set focus distance to layer, to this layer. So the focus distance is going to be set on this layer. I'm going to say okay. Now anything I do to change this camera, I'm going to change up the position, and I'm going to make sure that you see what's happening there. No matter what, even here, it's staying with that, the point of interest is staying with that word, or that layer that happens to be the word design. So I'm just going to keep moving it, and we can see that it always stays in no matter what. It stays with the camera no matter what, which is a pretty cool way to do that. And let's actually add some depth here, some more blur. So no matter what happens, if I move this in and out, it's going to always keep that one word in focus no matter. It's going to move with it, which is pretty cool way to play around with that. Let's even give us a little bit of a Y placement and see how the camera is actually moving in this regard. Pretty interesting way to play around with that. And if I reset all that, it brings me there. But I can always move things around to realign. And also what I can do here is, instead of not only keeping that particular one in focus, I can now also do camera link focus distance to layer. So no matter what happens to this, design, it will always stay connected to the camera. So let's move this word around and notice how my camera is moving with that word as well. It's linked together to that word. So pretty interesting way to play around with this as well. So I hope this helps you at least get a brief understanding of cameras, how they work. Obviously I went a little bit further into some of the things we can do. There's a little complication there in terms of picking the right camera, playing around with the right focus, if you want some blur, if you don't want some blur, how that all plays. But you definitely have to play around to get a better understanding of the cameras, how they can create interest and add some dimension to your design, and really help you move some things along in a slightly different way.